Hello and welcome to Atomo Workshop. Today I'm going to be making Joker's mask from Persona 5. Let's get started. I started off by printing and cutting up a template as a guide. Based on some reference images of the mask, I added some markings so that I would remember that one edge needed a bevel and that another needed a 45-degree angle on it. I also cut the template down the middle since it was symmetrical and copying the same piece twice would make things more symmetrical. In theory. Once the template was cut out, I got out a sheet of craft foam, about 3mm thick, then put the template on top of it and used a black marker to trace the piece, including the eye hole but excluding the black eye decoration, as I was going to add that after as a separate piece. Of course, I need two of these since I cut the template in half, so I traced it again separate from the first one. When this was done, I cut out what I had traced using a hobby knife, though you could use any knife you want really, or even some scissors if the foam is thin enough. Just know that when cutting craft foam, it is important to keep the blade from wandering, otherwise you could put an unwanted bevel on your piece as well as cause some rough edges. After EVA foam requires a very sharp blade. The foam likes to dull the blade in just a few uses, so keep a knife sharpener on hand. I did end up having quite a few rough edges on the mask, as I am not very well practiced in cutting out foam yet, but no worries, I can fix these sorts of things with my rotary tool. Using the sanding bit, I smoothed out those rough edges and made them nice and flat again, but to make sure the two halves were still symmetrical, I used some folded over tape to stick the halves back to back. Foam dust is very bad for you to breathe in, so wear a mask or respirator if you're using a rotary tool like this. After splitting them apart again, and while I still had the rotary tool out, I added those bevels I mentioned earlier, as well as that 45-degree angle. The bevel was added to soften the edges a little, so the mask would appear a little more refined and less like a basic cutout. The 45-degree angle made it so when the nose pieces were joined, they would create a point and more closely match the reference images. Craft and EVA foam gets quite fuzzy when sanded, so to get rid of them, I had to use a heat gun. This isn't the only benefit of using the heat gun though. The heat seals up all the tiny holes and imperfections in the foam, creating a more smooth and sort of shiny appearance. This in turn helps when painting as it results in a more smooth finish. Once the foam is warmed up like this, it actually becomes more pliable, so you can also form it into a new shape, and when it cools down again it will retain that new shape. I used this technique to make more of a curve in the mask and made it indent more around the nose. Before moving on to the black eye pieces, I needed to stick the two halves of the mask together. To do this, I used contact adhesive. This is essentially the same stuff used when making shoes. When done right, the bond this creates can last years and is ridiculously strong. To use it, you simply brush the glue on the two surfaces you want to stick together, then wait 5 to 10 minutes or so for it to get set up. But be warned, this stuff is super toxic, so again, wear a respirator, have a door open, have a fan blowing across your work area, just do whatever you have to do to get those fumes away from you. You might have noticed in the video I was using this. It's a homemade glue pot just to spread the contact adhesive on, and I hated it. I'd seen it recommended online, and I guess maybe a store-bought one would work better, but it just doesn't work on the thin foam. Moving on, it was time for the eyepieces. Like before, I used the template to trace an outline on the foam and cut it out. Again, these ended up quite rough, so I cleaned up the rough edges with the rotary tool. The eyepieces still looked a little weird when I placed them on the mask though, so I decided to soften the edges like I had on the outer edge of the mask to make it seem more like it was blending together. When gluing this down, it was important to line up the eye holes correctly, so before spreading the glue on, I lined out the eyes and traced around them with a Sharpie. This left me with a guide so I wouldn't put more glue down than I needed. This worked quite well, but I did still end up with some spill out, so I went in with some sandpaper once it had dried to get it off. Unfortunately, during my final round of using the rotary tool to tidy everything up, I managed to put a few gouges in the foam. So, just before painting, I used some polyfiller to fill in the gaps and create a more even finish. Now finally, it is time to paint. For the white, I am using Plastidip. This is used like any other spray paint but has special properties. Unlike traditional spray paints, this is completely flexible, meaning it won't crack or break apart when the mask is bent. On top of this, it is also very good at protecting the mask, so it won't even need a protective coat. For my first pass, I did not go for complete coverage, but instead just tried to avoid pooling, even if it meant wasting a little more of the Plastidip. That worked, I avoided pooling with no problem, however I did run into another issue of it creating some weird bubbles on the surface. I'm not sure why this happened though. My best guess is that I was too close to the mask when spraying. If you know why it did that, then please let me know in the comments. In the end, I sprayed 4 layers on both sides of the mask, and managed to get most of the bubbles out, but quite a few still remained. I then left it to dry for 24 hours. When I came back, I made sure it wasn't tacky, and then set to work painting the black pieces. Sadly, this is where things went a little wrong. For the black, I wanted to stick with the idea of the mask being very flexible, so I went with Hexaflex, sold by Polyprops for those of you in the UK. Hexaflex, much like Plastidip, is a flexible paint and is fairly good at protecting itself. When I first started painting it on, everything was going quite well, but then I started to do the finer areas, and I noticed the paint was quite runny, and it started to get on the white. After a while of trying to fight it, I just gave in and accepted my fate. Unfortunately, the black got on a lot of the white and needed significant repair. The brush I was using just wasn't good enough for the details I needed. So I had to go and buy some finer brushes to touch everything up and return it to normal. To touch up the white, I grabbed my Plastidip and sprayed it on some cardboard, so it would form a pool and I could use it as a normal paint. After just one pass, you could see a massive improvement. It took about 3 more passes on top of that to get everything nice and even, but by the end of it I ended up with this. This still has a couple of minor rough spots, but I am happy with it for now. This mask was for my brother, and he requested that it be as it was seen in the game, which means I won't be weathering this mask at all. But I did add some black around the eyes on the inside of the mask, as I noticed it kind of messed with your eyes having the white and black so close together. Now you might be wondering how I intended on attaching this to my face. In the game it doesn't appear to have a strap, and it doesn't attach to his face like a superhero's would. Plus, he can take it off whenever he likes with relative ease. One notable exception. So I came up with an idea to use those metal tabs that you pinch around your nose when wearing a dust mask. The idea being, if I put them on the inside, the wearer could just pinch the metal around their nose and it would stay on. So I ripped off the metal tab from one of my spare masks and tried tacking it down with some superglue, then coming in and reinforcing it with hot glue. This took quite a bit of trial and error, but eventually I got it stuck down. I then backed it with some foam so it wouldn't hurt my brother when he was wearing it for long periods like at a con. This did technically work, but when my brother and I tested it, it had a habit of wobbling and falling off when you look down. It seemed to be that just that single tab acted as a pivot point and made it flop around on your nose. So I ruined yet another mask and added that second tab to the bottom, and it made everything work great. You can see here it sits at just the right spot, sitting just a little bit away from the face, but tight enough so you can still look around and even take it off quite easily. So, final thoughts. Overall, I'm very pleased with how this turned out, but there are 2 things I would change. Number 1, the glue on the back is a bit ugly, and I imagine at some point I'll come back and paint over that just to make it look a bit nicer. In future, I'd probably be a bit less heavy-handed with it. Number 2 is I'm not perfectly happy with how sharp a contrast the black and the white is, and I would probably tape it off next time and maybe even use an airbrush. Well, that's going to have to be it for now, folks. If you have a suggestion or you know what happened with that Plastidip, then please let me know below or on Twitter. I'll see you next time.